Hey, this is Joel Duff, and I've been thinking, uh-oh, it's a kind of a scary thought. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about genetic entropy. All right, I'll explain genetic entropy in just a second if you're not familiar with it. And if you're not familiar with it, it's only because you're not familiar with the world of young Earth creationism. So I'll give you a little bit of a tiny primer, which is right over, over here to my side, as to what it is. But I'm a little bit frustrated with a live experience I had debating this particular topic of genetic entropy, and I've watched a number of videos, young Earth creationists talking about genetic entropy. And it got me thinking: can young Earth creationists take their theoretical idea of genetic entropy and apply it practically to practical issues, and apply it to real world issues with human evolution or human change? An example I've come up with here is I'm going to challenge young Earth creationists to think about genetic entropy and gender identity. Yeah, I'm going to go there tonight. Genetic entropy and genetic identity. What do I see the relationships there as? This is not going to be very long. I'm just going to let's just summarize what genetic entropy is. We're going to set the stage, and then I'm just going to toss out the bomb with respect to gender identity. All right, so genetic entropy, you can think of it this way. It basically postulates that genomes are ever accumulating mutations each generation. Yeah, sure, every genome. When we copy our genomes, we add new variations, right? We add new mutations, right? So that statement is a truism in the sense that genomes over each individual generation will add some new mutations. This leads to a decline in individual fitness. Right now, that's a postulate of the genetic entropy proposal by people like Sanford. Here's both editions of his book above me, and a few others. I would disagree with that particular postulate, but nonetheless, this is what young Earth creationists say, or those who are espousing this thing called genetic entropy. And then, because there's a decline in individual fitness or even population level fitness, the extinction of the species, including human beings, is inevitable. All species are on the decline. They're all going to disappear at some point because they're literally going to be driven into the ground by mutations. Because mutations are what? Well, another common postulate is that mutations never can lead to an increase in information. I got it there in quotes. I have to, because there's no definition for what information is provided by these folks that talk about information loss and gain. All right. But they would say that mutations almost always result in a loss of information, or this is the idea of the decay of the genome. You have good genes that are broken, turned into bad genes, right? And you can never recover a bad gene and turn it back into a good gene. I guess that would be the idea of information loss and information gain. So if you're always breaking genes, then we must always be falling apart. Get the idea? Entropy, right? The decay of things into lower energy states. Right? Simpler, more simple sets of molecules instead of more complicated organisms. Right? So it's a very easy concept to kind of grasp, and it sounds intuitive, right? Because yeah, we have a genome, we copy it, it makes mistakes, and then the next generation makes more mistakes. Isn't decay inevitable? We're not going down that rabbit trail to try to explain all the different problems, population genetics problems and other issues with this, and why this isn't really a problem. I'm going to say, okay, great. It's a problem. The human race is doomed to extinction in the not too distant future, and all other species are. Let's ask some other questions. Like, if you're right, then how do you apply it to these other questions, like gender identity? Just a little more background before we get to this gender identity thing. Here's an ICR article way back 2014. So this is early on in sort of this new idea of genetic entropy that's been percolating in young Earth creationism, and now it's becoming something that's very popular to talk about. Genetic entropy points to a young creation. And why would genetic entropy point to a young creation? Here's the money quote, all right? The money paragraph at the end of this short article by Jeff Tompkins. In the case of humans, Adam and Eve were originally created with perfect error-free genomes. I'm going to have a lot more to say about that later. I've got a bunch of ideas on that concept alone. That means there was no mutations present. So somehow the first genome is perfect. It's the original state, no mutations, no mess ups. Everything must work exactly as it was supposed to work. Then sin entered the world and the whole creation became cursed. So what changed? Perfection, sin. The human genome has essentially been on a downhill slide ever since. After all, if you started at perfection, you can't get better than perfection, right? So any change that occurs after there must be something less than perfection. So a mutation on the original perfect sequence must be a less perfect sequence. And therefore, and if you're constantly adding more of those, it has to be a decline, right? You have to have a loss of information, and you have to have a reduction in the overall fitness, or I guess maybe a better way to put it for young earth creationists, a reduction in the ability to perform the acts you were originally created to perform. Now, we're not actually gradually evolving better genomes, Tompkins says, right? The flip side, we're evolving less fit, less good genomes. Instead, the recently measured degradation patterns and rates clearly match the biblical model and time frame. Well, that's referencing some things he mentioned earlier, which includes this figure, which comes from a Stanford paper, not from the book, but from another paper they published in conjunction with the book. All right, and so you can see here's one of their examples of how the Bible proves genetic entropy. The declining lifespans of Noah and his descendants. Right? Noah gets off the ark. He lives 900 years. Each generation after that lives a shorter lifespan. And eventually we're reaching shorter and shorter and shorter lifespans all the time. Now, the thing is, today lifespans are actually increasing, but they would say that that's because of technology. All right. They would say that, well, we've come in and we've kind of rescued it. We kind of pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. Right? It's not that our genomes are getting any better. If anything, they're getting worse. And we're just kind of like running the treadmill faster and faster and faster in order to keep up and even actually slightly improve our lifespan. But eventually, our genome's going to decay so much, we're just going to fall off the back of the treadmill and we're all going to die. So they would point to this as evidence that, well, why did lifespans decrease so much? Right? From these incredibly long lifespans to much shorter lifespans in a short period of time. Well, it must be that mutations occurred and knocked out and broke different functions that allowed us to live longer and disrupted the aging process. So that got me thinking. Okay. All right, so they would point at this as one practical way that you can see genetic entropy, and you can see it biblically playing out before your eyes. Now, switching what seems like switching gears, let's talk a little bit about gender identity questions and questions of recognition of sex, right? Biological sex. And I'm just going to go back to an article. This is actually a fairly oral article as well by Elizabeth Mitchell from Answers in Genesis. I think this is 2013. And she's explaining how hermaphrodism can be a real thing, a real biological thing, right? The genetic gender of a baby is determined at the moment of fertilization. The DNA blueprint for sexual organ development is selected in accordance with the XXXY genotype. As with many other birth defects, hermaphrodism can result from either the abnormality of the DNA itself or a defect in development of the organ when the organs take shape. Right? So she blames the physical existence of hermaphrodism, right? The expression of both sex organs or both sex types in one individual as the result of mutation. Right? And then you can find in other literature, especially Answers in Genesis literature, because they love to talk about gender roles and gender and biological sex and so forth quite a bit. Anytime that they're confronted with situations where you say have XXY or so those are abnormalities of the chromosomes, or you might have androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is again a mutation. So that's a gene that's not performing correctly on, say, the Y chromosome, right? They point to individual mutations as causing these confusions, right? that cause the gradation between the sexes. And that got me thinking. I've never seen Answers in Genesis or anyone other young earth creationists connect the idea of genetic entropy and gender confusion or gender identity gradation. But if they're explaining them as mutations, and here's another part of the confusion I have, is that Answers in Genesis loves to talk about all the ills of society and the whole gender issues, right? It's a huge thing for them in the whole culture wars right now. But they like to make it sound like on the periphery as if this is a social issue and it's caused by pressure. In other words, it's caused by external factors and not by actual internal biology. Right. Only when pushed into a corner will they say that, well, there's certain instances where there's a biological explanation, but those are very, very rare. And that would be the case with this. In this case, if you read down this article, you're going to be pointing out this is an extremely rare situation. And so these are the exceptions and not the rule. And therefore, they want to just sort of sideline things that they call exceptions and not really, I would say, kind of not deal with them, and then kind of blame it on mutations. Well, let's now think about the implications of genetic entropy. We go back to this. All right, if lifespan could drop off so dramatically and so quickly because of an accumulation of mutations in our genome, breaking a whole bunch of genes and reducing our lifespan, and lifespan is a characteristic, right? Well, we have a whole bunch of different genes that determine our genetic identity, right? Our sex. And I know there's differences I know I'm using different terms here. I'm trying to cover sort of a whole bunch of bases at one time without making the distinctions. I'm really not here to get into a big battle about gender identity and all this. That's not really what I want to talk about. Solely want to use this as sort of a challenge or an interesting thought question to go through with the young earth creationists with respect to their beliefs about genetic entropy. Right, so if you can have this rapid decline in aging because of presumably a bunch of different genes being messed up and therefore reducing our ability to survive longer. So it's affecting lots of different of our processes, which then accumulate to the point where we can now no longer survive for a long period of time. What about gender? Gender is the product of, as I said before, lots of genes acting in concert with one another, and a whole bunch of developmental processes, right? A whole bunch of little switches have to go off and on just at the right moment in time in order to trigger the right signals and have the right amounts of hormones and all these different things, right? And so if you are constantly breaking the clear signals that make male and the clear signal that makes female, aren't you going to end up with more gray zone in between? Aren't you going to end up with more gender fluidity as the result? Isn't that the expectation of genetic entropy? Isn't that what young earth creationists should predict? Well, that's what I'm going to say. All right. This is what I think. All right. All right. Does genetic entropy in humans necessitate the degrading of the two sexes into increasingly common non-binary sex types? I think it does, but young earth creationists out there, tell me otherwise. Tell me how this wouldn't result in that. Tell me how God is safeguarding human beings from losing their sexual identities altogether. Or maybe you would agree. Maybe you think this is actually the case, and this actually is a valid application of genetic entropy to human beings. And maybe this is the reason we'll go extinct, right? Because if eventually there aren't enough males and females to reproduce, right, then it's going to be hard to continue the species. Let's go through my proposed logic for young earth creationists. Like, this is an argument they could make. They could write, I'm giving you an article for you. Young earth creationists out there, pick this up, write an article. It's on me. Start out with this. The human genome is accumulating mutations. I know you all agree with that. You all will say, yes, the human genome is constantly accumulating mutations, and this is a huge problem. And you believe that decay is irreversible. I hear that all the time. I don't happen to believe that's necessarily the case. For any particular species, that's not always that does not have to be a true statement, right? But for young Earth creationists, they feel like this is absolutely has to be true because of this irreversibility that you can't somehow get fitness back if you've lost some fitness, right, through mutations. But again, I'm not here to argue why that's a wrong statement. I'm here just to tell you that that's what young Earth creationists will say. And so this would be a perfect line of reasoning for them. Mutations can disrupt normal gender development. Can you argue that's not the case? Right? If you can point to cases where gender is disrupted by mutations, changes in the genome, and you believe the mutations are happening, then you have to agree that gender can be changed by these mutations. And since this is an irreversible situation in the human condition, it must be getting worse. It has to be getting worse over time. It has to be accumulating, right? There has to, generation by generation, there has to be more and more and more and more gender identity issues caused by mutations. Therefore, gender will become more and more confused. I just said that, but that's my next statement here. And then we could end up by saying gender differences will become lost over time. All right, distinct gender differences become lost, causing the end of the human species. All right, so I want to know, where am I wrong in this form of logic? And what I mean by that, again, maybe preface this. What I mean by that is, where am I reading the young Earth creationist logic incorrectly? All right, so young Earth creationists tell me, where would you disagree here and say that this isn't happening? Or do you think this is actually what is happening? But the caveat I'll give you here is, if that's what you're going to say, then I think that you need to send reminders to Ken Ham about that, right? Because he acts like somehow if we just reform ourselves, right, and this country gets on the right track, and we have the right leaders, and we pass the right laws, that somehow we can reverse the whole thing with all the different gender questions we have, right? And because he sees it as like we're sliding toward having more and more gender confusion, but he seems to blame that on society. He doesn't seem to blame that on mutations. Sure, he blames it on sin, but sin in society. And he sees that as somewhat fixable. At least that's the kind of the perception I get, is that it is somewhat fixable. It's stoppable. But if you believe in genetic entropy, I don't think you can say it's stoppable. You have to say it's inevitable. And so you got to deal with the consequences of that. Right? It's one thing to say that, and I don't think it's necessarily appropriate to say this, and I don't think Christians should be making this particular argument, but I do hear them making this argument as a way of not dealing with the question. They'll say, oh, well, yeah, yes, there are individuals that are XXY, or there is this particular mutation, but it's extremely rare. So there are some individuals that have, have these different types of genetic traits. All right. But they're the exceptions. All right. And we're not going to really deal with the exceptions. That's not what most people are. Well, the thing with genetic entropy is the exceptions will become the rule, right? They will become the rule because you've defined those who don't have mutations as representing the perfect state. And your model says that the perfect state can't remain perfect because it will be degraded by sin, which is mutations. Because you've attached the idea of man's sin with causing physical mutations in organisms as having that consequence, that physical consequence. Right? So that's my challenge. That's where I'm asking young Earth creationists to think through the consequences of what they're saying when they make up these. My first thing about what genetic entropy is, simply that mutations happen, they accumulate, and it's going to kill all humans. Well, part of killing all humans is it's going to do a whole bunch of other things first to the genetic condition, which is, I just picked out genetic identity because it's a catchy, probably a clickbaity title, right? To get you to watch this. But we could probably pick some other things too, all right, which have a genetic basis to them, and ask, okay, so how should we treat those things if we know that they can only get worse over time and that there's no hope for them to get better, right? Because it's unavoidable, because they're caused by mutations. Mutations are accumulating, right? This genetic entropy model, when you apply it to stuff, it's a really depressing model, because it says there really isn't any hope. And maybe that's why there's a lot of Christians who really do have that kind of feeling, like we're just here in this world sort of waiting it out, and everything's just getting worse and worse around us. And so we're just sort of like hunkering down, uh, you know, just surviving, ready to escape from the world, because there is no hope for a better, world. Uh, I'm not that pessimistic about the human condition or God's ability to preserve the human race and to affect the human race in a positive way. But if he has to work against genetic entropy, according to young Earth creationists, genetic entropy is a force that it almost sounds like God can't even control, right? Because it's unleashed by sin, and therefore it's just rampant and unstoppable. Okay, well, those are my thoughts. I those are all the things I've thought of so far. So tell me what you think. Am I being unreasonable by trying to apply genetic entropy to questions like this and present them as challenges to young Earth creationists? Or am I just completely missing something? Am I missing something in my logic somewhere? Is there a step here that can kind of like help young Earth creationists get out of this problem? All right, thanks. We'll talk to you later. Bye bye.